"I'll have you fired before dessert," Daniel Sterling said, not loud, not angry, just certain, the kind of certainty that comes from a man who had never been told no. And in a room filled with crystal glasses, tailored suits, and quiet million-dollar conversations, that sentence didn't just land, it echoed, slicing clean through the soft hum of jazz and the low murmur of deals being made over $200 steaks and $500 bottles of wine. And for a moment everything paused, forks hovering midair. Glass set down a little too slowly, eyes shifting not toward him, but toward her, the woman he had just reduced to nothing with a single sentence. Amara Hayes didn't move, not right away, her posture still straight, her tray steady in her hands, her face calm in a way that didn't match the tension tightening across the room, because she had heard worse, because she had learned early that silence, when chosen, was not weakness, it was control. The restaurant itself felt like a stage designed for power, warm golden lights reflecting off polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a skyline that pulsed with ambition. Every table occupied by people who measured worth in numbers, in influence, in how quickly they could make or break a deal. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a man whose reputation traveled faster than his private jet, a man known for closing deals before dessert and ending careers before coffee. He didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to, power like his didn't shout, it whispered and expected the world to lean in. Amara had noticed that the moment he walked in, the way managers straightened their jackets, the way staff moved just a little faster, the way conversation subtly shifted to accommodate his presence. She had been serving table 12 when his party arrived, 5 investors, 1 attorney, and Daniel at the head, already controlling the rhythm of the evening before the first drink had been poured. She had listened without looking like she was listening, a skill you learn when you spend long nights invisible in rooms where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars are made between bites of food. She had caught fragments, percentages, projections, a number repeated twice, just slightly different the second time, small enough that no one reacted but not small enough to go unnoticed by someone paying attention. And Amara always paid attention because attention was survival, because being overlooked meant you saw everything, and everything mattered. Daniel reached for his glass again, not looking at her as he spoke, dismissing her with a flick of his hand like she was part of the furniture. "You spilled it, didn't you?" he added, even though the tablecloth was spotless, even though nothing had happened except his need to remind the room who held the power. A couple of his guests chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that wasn't about humor but alignment, agreement disguised as politeness. Amara stepped forward just enough to refill a glass, her movements precise, controlled, unshaken, and still she said nothing because timing was everything. And somewhere between the second misquoted number and the third confident promise Daniel made about returns he couldn't possibly guarantee, something shifted, subtle, invisible, but real, like the air just before a storm changes direction. And though no one else seemed to notice, Amara did, her eyes lifting just slightly, not in defiance, not yet, but in recognition, because moments like this didn't announce themselves, they revealed themselves. And she had just realized that the most powerful man in the room had made a mistake, and worse, he had made it in front of someone he believed didn't matter at all. Daniel did not notice it at first because men like him rarely noticed anything that did not serve them immediately. He leaned back slightly in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket as if the entire moment had already passed, as if the quiet shift in the room was nothing more than background noise. But across the table one of the investors, a man named Richard Halpern with silver hair and a habit of listening more than speaking, had stopped mid-sip, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in suspicion yet but in calculation, because numbers were his language and something in Daniel's earlier statement had not aligned. Amara moved again, her step soft against the marble floor, refilling a glass here, clearing a plate there, her presence still invisible to most, but her attention locked, precise, tracing every word, every hesitation, every overconfident promise Daniel continued to make. "We are projecting a 32% return within the first 12 months. Daniel said smoothly, his voice steady. Practice, the kind of line he had delivered 100 times in rooms just like this, but Amara had heard the earlier number 38% said with the same confidence, the same certainty, and she knew enough not from formal meetings or boardrooms, but from years of listening, of absorbing, of connecting patterns that others assumed she could not even see, that discrepancies like that did not happen by accident. Not at this level, not with stakes this high. Richard set his glass down slowly, the faint clink sharper than it should have been, and for the first time that evening Daniel's rhythm faltered just slightly, just enough. "Did you say 32%? Richard asked, His tone calm but deliberate, the kind of question that did not need to be repeated. Daniel smiled, the same controlled smile, but there was a flicker now, almost invisible. Yes, conservative estimate, he replied. But the room had shifted. Conversations at nearby tables continued. But this table had tightened, focused, the air no longer relaxed but alert. Amara stepped closer, just within reach of the table, her tray balanced, her expression unchanged, and in that narrow space between being ignored and being noticed, she made a decision, not loud, not dramatic, just precise. She leaned in slightly toward Richard as she placed the glass down, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the table, but clear enough that it could not be dismissed. He said 38%. Earlier, she said, then straightened immediately, stepping back into her role, into her silence, as if nothing had happened, but everything had. Richard's eyes lifted slowly to Daniel, the pause that followed stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable. Daniel's jaw tightened for the first time that night. Not in anger, but in recognition, because control had slipped, not completely, not yet, but enough, and in rooms like this, even the smallest crack could become a fracture. I believe we need to revisit those projections, Richard said, no longer casual, no longer playing along, and just like that, the center of the room shifted, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more dangerous. Doubt. And Daniel Sterling, who had walked in expecting to own the night, realized that the one person he had dismissed without a second thought had just changed the direction of everything without raising her voice at all. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth it had not planned to hear. Daniel Sterling felt it before he saw it, the subtle withdrawal of attention, the way eyes that had been fixed on him now moved slightly away, not dramatically, not disrespectfully, but enough to signal that control was no longer absolute. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, grounding himself in the only thing he trusted, dominance through precision. Let me clarify, he said, his voice still smooth, still composed, but tighter now, measured in a way it had not been before. The earlier figure included aggressive expansion scenarios. This is the stabilized projection. It was a strong recovery, the kind that had saved him before, the kind that usually ended questions before they fully formed, but tonight was different because doubt, once introduced, does not leave quietly. Richard Halpern did not nod this time. He did not smile. He simply reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, the soft glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses as he scrolled through notes, numbers, timestamps, and suddenly the table was no longer a stage for Daniel's performance, it was an audit, and everyone at the table felt it. The attorney sitting to Daniel's right shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still. One of the younger investors leaned back, folding his arms, not disengaging but recalculating risk in real time. And through it all, Amara moved quietly, clearing a plate, replacing a napkin, her presence returning to invisibility, but the impact of her single sentence lingering like a fingerprint no one could erase. Daniel noticed her now, not directly, not openly, but in the way his eyes flickered for half a second too long when she passed, as if trying to reconcile how someone he had dismissed so completely had inserted herself into a moment that mattered. This much, you said 38% at 1942, Richard said finally, his voice calm, precise, reading the timestamp from his screen. And that was the moment the air tightened completely, no more pretending, no more casual pacing, just facts laid bare under soft golden lights. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, buying time, recalculating, because men like him did not panic, they adapted, but adaptation requires space, and that space was shrinking. As I said, that figure was contextual, he replied, but the confidence had shifted, not gone, but altered, like a structure with a hairline crack beginning to show under pressure. Across the table, another investor, a woman named Claire Weston, who had been silent until now, leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting clean through the tension. Contextual or not, inconsistency at this stage is concerning. And just like that, it was no longer one question, it was many, unspoken but present, stacking, building, the kind of pressure that does not explode but compresses slowly, relentlessly. Daniel's world had always been built on control, on commanding rooms like this with certainty so complete that no one thought to question it. But certainty is fragile when it is built on assumptions, and tonight, his greatest assumption had been the simplest one, that the people who seemed invisible did not matter, that they did not listen, that they did not understand. And now, as the room leaned further away from him and closer to scrutiny, that assumption was unraveling in real time, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more final, credibility slipping, inch by inch, under the weight of a single, quiet correction. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a knot being pulled 1 inch at a time, and Daniel Sterling felt it in the smallest details. The way no one reached for their drinks anymore, the way every movement at the table slowed as if even breathing too quickly might disrupt something fragile and newly uncertain. He had built his career on moments like this, on navigating pressure, on turning hesitation into advantage, but this was different. This was not hesitation, this was erosion, slow and deliberate, and for the first time that evening Daniel looked directly at Amara Hayes, not as a server, not as background, but as a variable he had failed to account for. She was already moving away, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant as if she had never spoken at all, but Daniel's focus lingered, because now he understood something he had ignored before. She had not guessed, she had known, and knowledge in the wrong place at the wrong time was dangerous. "Let us stay focused," Daniel said, reclaiming the floor with a sharper edge, his voice cutting through the tension with renewed intention. "The fundamentals of this deal remain unchanged." It was a strategic reset: redirect attention, minimize the inconsistency, move forward before doubt could deepen, and for a brief moment it almost worked. One of the investors nodded slightly, another shifted forward as if ready to continue, but Richard did not move, his phone still in his hand, his gaze steady, and Claire Weston leaned back just enough to create distance, not physical but psychological, the kind that signals reconsideration. "Fundamentals rely on trust," she said evenly, "not confrontational, not emotional, just precise," and precision was harder to deflect than accusation. Daniel held her gaze, his expression composed, but behind it calculations were running fast, adjusting projections, reframing language, searching for the exact combination of words that would restore alignment, because in rooms like this perception could be rebuilt if controlled quickly enough. But then Richard spoke again, quieter this time but somehow heavier. "What else has been presented differently?" And that question did not target a single number, it opened a door, one that could not be closed with a single answer. The attorney beside Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, pulling a folder slightly closer as if preparing for scrutiny rather than negotiation. And across the table, the younger investor who had been silent until now uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, not in support but in interest, the kind that comes when risk becomes visible. Amara, now near the edge of the room, paused for half a second, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to observe the shift she had set in motion. She did not smile, she did not react, because this was never about proving a point, it was about revealing one, and once revealed, it did not need help to grow. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled release, then straightened, adjusting his jacket. Again, restoring the image, the posture, the version of himself that had dominated rooms like this for years. "Everything has been disclosed appropriately," he said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, but the weight of the room had changed, and words, no matter how precise, could not fully restore what had already begun to slip, because credibility is not lost in a single moment, it is questioned, and once questioned, it demands proof, and proof, unlike confidence, cannot be improvised. And as the silence returned, deeper now, more defined, Daniel realized that the conversation was no longer about the deal he came to close. It was about whether he could still be trusted to close anything at all. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed again, Amara Hayes continued her work, carrying a tray, adjusting a glass, moving through the same room that had once ignored her completely, now quietly reshaped by the one moment she chose to speak. The silence no longer felt fragile. It felt decisive, like a verdict forming without needing to be spoken aloud, and Daniel Sterling could see it now in the smallest shifts around the table. Richard Halpern had placed his phone face down, not as a sign of trust, but as a signal that he had seen enough for now. Claire Weston's posture had changed completely, no longer leaning in with curiosity but sitting back with measured distance, her fingers lightly resting against the stem of her glass without lifting it, observing instead of participating. And the younger investor, who had once followed Daniel's lead without question, was now watching him with something far more dangerous than doubt: evaluation. The kind that strips away reputation and looks only at risk. Daniel felt the momentum slipping further, not in a dramatic collapse but in quiet withdrawal, the kind that happens when confidence erodes beneath the surface, and he knew that if he did not regain control now, the night would not end in negotiation, it would end in retreat. "I think we are overcomplicating a minor discrepancy," Daniel said, his voice firm again, attempting to compress the narrative back into something manageable, something dismissible. "Our financial model has been thoroughly vetted," he continued, each word sharpened with intent, but intent alone was no longer enough. because the room had crossed a line, invisible but absolute, from belief to verification. And once that shift happens, authority does not lead, evidence does. Richard leaned forward. Slightly, not aggressive, not confrontational, but anchored. Then walk us through it again, he said, calm, steady, but leaving no room for deflection. And just like that, the dynamic inverted. Daniel was no longer presenting, he was proving. The attorney beside him opened the folder fully now, sliding a few documents forward, not to support Daniel, but to follow along, to confirm, to check. And Claire added, her voice even from the original assumptions, emphasizing the word original just enough to make its meaning clear. Daniel nodded once, a controlled gesture, masking the recalibration happening beneath his composed exterior. Because this was not how this meeting was supposed to go. He was supposed to lead, to guide, to close, not to defend, not to retrace, not to justify, and yet here he was, reconstructing his own narrative under a spotlight he did not control. Amara Hayes moved along the perimeter of the room, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of service, but her awareness remained sharp. She could feel the shift fully now, not just at the table, but in the energy of the entire space, because when power moves even quietly it echoes. She passed behind Daniel once more, close enough to hear the slight pause between his sentences, the fraction of a second where certainty used to live and now hesitation flickered. And in that moment Daniel spoke again, outlining numbers, projections, timelines, but something had changed. The words were still precise, still polished, but they no longer landed with unquestioned authority. They landed with scrutiny, each statement followed not by agreement, but by silent calculation. And across the table Richard's expression remained neutral, but his eyes moved differently now, tracking details, connecting dots, no longer listening to be convinced, but to confirm what he already suspected, that something did not align. And as the explanation continued, the weight of the room settled into something final, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The deal was no longer about opportunity, it was about risk. And Daniel Sterling, who had walked in expecting to command the night, was now standing at the center of a conversation he could not fully control, while the one person he had dismissed without a second thought continued to move quietly through the background, unseen again, but no longer irrelevant, because the truth she had introduced was still there, growing, expanding, reshaping the outcome one silent realization at a time. By the time Daniel Sterling reached the end of his explanation, the room had stopped pretending. The polite rhythm of nods and murmured agreement had vanished, replaced by something colder, more exact, the kind of silence that does not wait for persuasion but demands verification. Richard Halpern leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled together, not impressed, not convinced, simply processing, while Claire Weston glanced down at the documents in front of her, her eyes scanning line by line with deliberate care, no longer listening to Daniel's voice as the primary source of truth, but treating it as one version among many. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the turning point, because once a voice becomes just another input instead of the authority, its power fades quickly. Daniel could feel it now in a way he could not ignore. His words were still precise, still structured, but they no longer anchored the room, they floated, subject to examination, to doubt, to quiet correction. And across from him, the younger investor finally spoke, his tone measured but direct. These projections assume a growth rate that does not align with your current market share. It was not an accusation, it was a statement, and statements like that do not ask permission. They establish ground. Daniel turned slightly toward him, ready to respond, but before he could, Richard added, and the earlier figure suggests a different baseline altogether, reinforcing the point, stacking pressure without raising his voice. And just like that, the conversation shifted again, no longer a single discrepancy, but a pattern, small inconsistencies linking together into something harder to dismiss. Daniel's jaw tightened, not visibly to most, but enough because now he understood the real problem. It was not the numbers alone, it was the narrative around them. The confidence that once shielded every detail had been pierced, and now every detail stood exposed, waiting to be tested. Amara Hayes moved past the table once more, carrying a tray of freshly poured glasses, her step steady, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharp. She could hear the shift in tone, the subtle change in pacing, the way Daniel's sentences now carried a fraction more weight, a fraction more caution, and she knew what that meant, not defeat, not yet, but vulnerability, the kind that spreads quietly. Daniel adjusted his posture again, leaning forward, reclaiming space. Our growth strategy includes expansion into underdeveloped sectors that are not yet reflected in current market share, he said, his voice firm, reclaiming structure, rebuilding the framework piece by piece, and for a moment it held, the logic was sound, the delivery controlled, but the room did not return to him. It stayed where it was, balanced, cautious, waiting. Because once trust is questioned, it does not return on explanation alone, it requires proof, and proof takes time. Time Daniel did not have tonight. Claire looked up again, meeting his gaze directly. Then those sectors should have been clearly outlined from the start, she said, not harsh, not confrontational, but final in a way that closed the gap between explanation and expectation. And Daniel understood then, fully, that the evening had crossed a threshold he could not reverse with skill alone, because skill depends on perception, and perception had already shifted. The deal was no longer moving toward closure, it was stalling, slowing, recalibrating into something uncertain, and in that uncertainty power redistributed itself quietly, away from him, across the table, into the hands of those now asking the questions, and behind it all, unseen again, Amara Hayes continued her work, her presence once more blending into the background, but the moment she had created still unfolding, still expanding, still reshaping the outcome in ways no one could ignore, least of all the man who had once believed she did not matter at all. The shift was no longer subtle. It had settled into the room like a new reality that no one could ignore. Daniel Sterling could feel it in the way no one interrupted him anymore. Not because they agreed, but because they were done being led. They were listening differently now, not for vision but for verification, and that difference changed everything. He paused briefly, just long enough to measure the distance that had formed between him and the table, then continued, but the cadence had changed, slower, more deliberate, each word placed carefully as if stepping across unstable ground. We can provide additional documentation to support the expansion assumptions, he said, shifting from certainty to supplementation, from authority to justification, and across from him, Richard Halpern nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, the kind that signals the next step rather than a conclusion. That would be necessary. Richard replied, his tone even but the implication clear. Necessary meant not optional, meant not yet sufficient, and Claire Weston followed with a quiet addition, and independently reviewed, a small phrase almost gentle, but it landed with weight because it removed Daniel from control of the narrative entirely, placing validation in external hands, and just like that, the structure of the deal changed from confidence-based to evidence-based. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing it, recalculating again, because this was no longer about closing tonight, it was about surviving the scrutiny that would follow. And that realization carried its own cost, time, leverage, perception, all shifting at once. The younger investor glanced at the others, then back to Daniel, his voice measured but no longer deferential. We should pause until that review is complete. And there it was, not rejection, not yet, but delay, the kind that often becomes distance, the kind that allows doubt to grow in the quiet space between meetings. Daniel held his expression steady, nodding once as if this had always been part of the plan, as if the night was still under his control, but inside, he knew the truth. Momentum had been lost, and momentum, once broken, is rarely restored the same way. The table began to shift physically now, glasses moved, chairs adjusted slightly, the rigid focus loosening just enough to signal that the critical moment had passed, not resolved, but redirected. And as the conversation transitioned into logistics, timelines for follow-up, documentation requests, next steps that sounded structured but felt uncertain, Amara Hayes moved once more along the edge of the room, her presence quiet, her expression unchanged. She placed a fresh glass of water beside an empty seat, adjusted a folded napkin with the same precision she had used all night, and for a brief moment Daniel's eyes met hers, not long, not openly, but enough to acknowledge what had happened, enough to recognize the source of the shift he could not fully control, and in that brief exchange something unspoken passed between them, not confrontation, not victory, just awareness. Because Amara did not need to say anything else, she had already done what mattered. She had introduced truth into a room built on assumption, and now that truth was moving on its own, reshaping outcomes, redistributing power quietly, steadily, while the man who had once dismissed her stood at the center of a deal that was no longer his to command. The conversation did not end, it unraveled slowly, with the kind of quiet finality that no one announced but everyone understood. Chairs shifted back an inch, glasses were lifted not to celebrate but to fill the silence, and the rhythm of the table changed from pursuit to retreat. Daniel Sterling remained composed, his posture still sharp, his expression controlled, but the room no longer moved with him. It moved around him, and that distinction was everything. Richard Halpern stood first, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a measured rise that carried more weight than any spoken decision. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once at the others then at Daniel. "We will wait for the updated materials," he said, calm, final, not leaving space for negotiation, and Claire Weston followed, gathering her documents with deliberate care. Her voice soft but unmistakably resolved. "We will reconvene after independent verification." And just like that, what had started as a closing dinner had become a postponement, a pause that carried consequences far beyond the table. The younger investor nodded as well, already mentally moving on, recalibrating priorities, shifting attention elsewhere, because in rooms like this, time does not wait, it reallocates. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the movement around him, the quiet exodus of interest, the subtle but undeniable shift of power away from his side of the table, and when he finally stood, it was not to lead, but to follow the exit of a deal that was no longer within his grasp. Amara Hayes watched it all from a distance, her hands steady as she cleared the final glasses, her presence once again blending into the background of a room that was returning to its normal rhythm. But nothing about what had just happened was normal, because moments like this do not announce themselves as turning points, they reveal themselves later in outcomes, in missed opportunities, in deals that never quite come back the same way. Daniel stepped away from the table, his pace measured, controlled, but slower than when he had arrived, and as he passed near the service station, he paused, just for a second, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to acknowledge the presence he had once dismissed entirely. "You heard everything," he said quietly. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement shaped by realization. Amara looked at him, her expression calm, steady, not defensive, not proud, just present. "I listen," she replied simply, her voice even, and that was all, no explanation, no apology, no elaboration, because none was needed. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but different from anything he had shown her before. Not dominance, not dismissal, but recognition. And then he moved on, walking past her, past the space where control had slipped, into a night that no longer belonged to him the way he had expected. And behind him, Amara returned to her work, adjusting a glass, folding a napkin, continuing in the same quiet rhythm she had carried all evening. But the room she moved through had changed, not because she had raised her voice, not because she had demanded attention, but because she had chosen the exact moment to speak, and in doing so, had shifted everything without ever stepping out of her place, proving in the most quiet way possible that presence does not require permission, and truth does not need volume to be heard. The restaurant returned to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm it had before. The music resumed, soft and polished, the conversations picked back up, low and controlled, but beneath it all, something had shifted, something that could not be reset simply by moving on. Daniel Sterling stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretching before him in glass and steel and endless motion, and for the first time that evening he stopped, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he had something to process, something that did not fit into the clean, predictable structure he had built his life around. He had walked into that room expecting control, expecting compliance, expecting another deal to close before dessert, and instead, he had walked out with questions, with delays, with doubt attached to his name in a way that no presentation could immediately erase. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, a message from his assistant already asking about next steps, about follow-up materials, about damage control phrased in professional language, and Daniel looked at the screen for a moment before locking it again, because the answer was not immediate, not clean, not something that could be fixed with a single call. Back inside, Amara Hayes finished resetting the table, her movements steady, practiced, as if the night had unfolded like any other shift. She aligned the silverware, smoothed the tablecloth, replaced the glasses with quiet precision, and if anyone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual, just a server doing her job in a high-end restaurant. But the truth of the night lingered in the smallest details, in the way the staff moved with a slightly different awareness, in the way a few glances followed her just a second longer than before, not with praise, not with attention, but with recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken. Her manager approached briefly, nodding once, not asking questions, not offering commentary, just acknowledging that something had happened, even if it was not fully understood, and Amara nodded back just as simply, because she was not there for recognition. She never had been. She had learned long ago that the world did not always reward the loudest voice. Sometimes it shifted for the quietest one. Later that night, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed slightly, she stepped outside as well, the same city stretching before her, the same night air, but a different weight entirely, not heavy, not overwhelming, just real, grounded. She did not replay the moment in her mind the way others might have, she did not need to, because for her, it was not a victory, it was alignment, a moment where truth met timing and did what it always does when given space. It revealed, somewhere across the street, a black car pulled away from the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the city lights as it disappeared into traffic, and inside it, Daniel Sterling sat back, quieter than before, not defeated, but changed in a way he could not yet define, because for all his power, for all his control, he had just learned something that no boardroom had ever taught him, that influence is not absolute, that authority can be questioned, and that the people he once overlooked could carry a weight he had never measured. And as the city moved on, as the night settled into its usual rhythm, one truth remained, quiet but unshakable. He had money, he had status, he had built an empire that commanded rooms, but tonight, in the one moment that mattered most, she had something he could not buy. And that had changed everything.